A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. You know, I was thinking about Ezra the other day. Daniel and Hannah's little guy. He's almost 9 months old now, right?
He is, born last July.
And I was just picturing it. He's in his crib in Jerusalem, maybe just dozing off. And then that siren starts. That piercing electronic wail. And his parents have, 90 seconds?
About that, depending on their location. The Homefront command guidelines are very specific. It's not a vague suggestion, it's a calculated window based on the distance from Gaza and the type of threat. For some communities closer to the border, it's 15 seconds. 15, that's not time to think, that's time to react.
15 seconds. I can't even process that. So for Daniel and Hannah, it's 90 seconds to go from dead asleep to scooping up a baby, grabbing a go bag, and getting to a sheltered space. And I'm sitting here in my quiet apartment thinking, what does that even register as for a 9-month-old brain? It's not a memory he'll form, but it's got to be something, right? It has to leave some kind of imprint.
It's a massive sensory input. And Daniel's prompt this week zooms out from their specific situation to ask that exact question, but on a grand scale. How do families raise young children during conflict, crisis, prolonged uncertainty? What does the research actually say beyond the headlines? Because the headlines give you the body count and the political analysis. They don't tell you about the bedtime routines in the basement.
Right, because the instinct is to think, that child is being damaged, that environment is toxic for development. But the research, it's more complicated than that, and frankly, more hopeful. It's not a simple equation of war equals broken child.
Much more complicated. And the single biggest finding, the one that overturns a lot of assumptions, is this. It's not the sirens, it's not the bombs, it's not the conflict itself that is the primary determinant of a child's developmental outcome. It's the stress response of the parent. The parental nervous system is the mediator.
So the baby is reading the parent, not the war.
That's the core mechanism. A 2023 meta-analysis in the journal X-Child Development looked at dozens of studies from conflict zones and found that the transfer of cortisol, the stress hormone, from mother to infant was the single strongest predictor of cognitive and emotional outcomes. Stronger than proximity to violence, stronger than socioeconomic disruption. The biochemical signature of the parent's fear is what the child's developing brain is calibrating itself around. It's like the parent's stress becomes the ambient weather of the child's inner world.
That's wild. So in a way, the baby's environment isn't the war zone. The baby's environment is the parent's face, the parent's voice, the parent's smell. And if that environment is flooded with panic,
the child's system floods in response. Their hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, their HPA axis, which regulates stress, gets programmed for a high alert baseline. But here's the counterintuitive part, and this is where the resilience research gets really interesting. In many cases, the child's system adapts faster than the parents.
Explain that. Because that seems backwards. You'd think the adult, with all their life experience and cognitive tools, would adapt better.
There's a study from the University of Haifa in 2022 that tracked families in southern Israel, communities that were under periodic rocket fire. They measured anxiety levels in parents and children over 18 months. What they found was a divergence. After about a year and a half of this intermittent threat, the children's reported anxiety levels plateaued. They habituated. The parents' anxiety, however, continued to climb. The parents became more sensitized over time, while the children became more desensitized. The parents were accumulating a backlog of fear, each siren adding to the last, while the children were, in a neurological sense, treating each event as a discrete, survivable occurrence.
So the kids adapted to the new normal faster than the adults did.
Their nervous systems are more plastic. They're designed to adapt to the environment they're born into, for better or worse. A baby born in Jerusalem in 2025 doesn't know that sirens are abnormal. That becomes part of the fabric of their world. The parrot, however, remembers a world without sirens. They're carrying the contrast, the loss, the fear for the future. That's a heavier cognitive load. The child's brain is building its first operating system on this hardware. The parent is trying to run new, terrifying software on an old system, and it's causing glitches.
That connects to something I read about the London Blitz. There were these letters, diaries from mothers in 1941, and a common theme was this strange reversal. The mother would be terrified, huddled in a shelter with her infant, and the baby would just fall asleep or start cooing. And the mother would write about how the baby's calmness was the only thing that calmed her down. It was a lifeline. It was this tiny, breathing proof that the world hadn't completely ended.
That's co-regulation in action. And it's a two-way street. We talk about parents regulating children, but in extremis, the child's baseline state can regulate the parent. A sleeping infant is a powerful signal of safety. If the baby is asleep, the brainstem reads the environment as safe enough for sleep, so the parent borrows that signal. It's a beautiful, desperate biological hack. The most sophisticated anti-aircraft system in the world is a sleeping baby, because it convinces the most terrified brain that it's okay to power down.
Desperate is the word, because the practical reality is insane. Let's talk about the 90-second rule in practice. It's not just a dash to a shelter. For a parent with an infant, it's a logistical nightmare. You're not just grabbing yourself. You're grabbing formula, diapers, a favorite blanket, maybe a medication, and you're doing it while your body is screaming at you to run. The cognitive load in that moment is immense. Do you grab the pre-packed bag or the baby first? The bag has the baby's medicine, but the baby is the point. It's a horrible split-second triage.
And that's where routine becomes armor. Not a complex routine, but a ritualized sequence. I spoke to a researcher who interviewed parents in Kyiv and in Israeli border communities. The consistent report was that the parents who coped best were the ones who turned the sprint into a practice drill. They had a siren bag always packed by the door. They had a specific order of operations: scoop baby, grab bag, go. They practiced it when there was no siren. They turned a moment of pure panic into a muscle memory procedure. One mother in Kiev described it as choreography for the apocalypse. She and her toddler had a little song they'd sing during the drill. When the real sirens came, they sang the song.
It's like a fire drill, but for real, 3 times a week. And the consistency of the procedure itself becomes a source of predictability for the child. The child may not understand rocket, but they understand this is the sequence where I get held very tightly and we move quickly to a small, safe space. The ritual contains the fear. It gives the chaos a shape. A 2024 study on Ukrainian children in Kharkiv found that those whose parents maintained a consistent goodnight routine, even during bombardment, showed 40% fewer sleep disturbances than those whose routines were abandoned.
You see that in other conflicts too. The siege of Sarajevo. Parents there dealt with sniper fire, which is a different kind of terror. It's random, silent, no siren. The research on that period talks about the Sarajevo sleep method. Parents would use rhythmic humming, constant physical contact to mask the sudden cracks of gunfire. They created an auditory and tactile cocoon of predictability around the infant, insulating them from the unpredictable violence outside. The sound of a mother's humming became the dominant signal, overriding the sound of the shot.
And it worked. Not perfectly, but studies of children who were infants during that siege show markedly better outcomes when that kind of sensory buffering was employed. The key was the parents' ability to remain a consistent, regulating presence despite their own terror. Which brings us to the hardest part, the guilt.
Oh, the guilt is massive. Daniel's prompt mentions it specifically. The feeling that you are failing your child by raising them in this place. That you are selfish for staying, or cowardly for wanting to stay, or that you've ruined their one chance at a safe childhood. It's a uniquely corrosive thought because it attacks your identity as a protector.
And the research is clear on this. That guilt, that parental anguish, is itself a potent stressor that directly impacts the child. It's a vicious cycle. You feel guilty for raising your child in a war zone. That guilt makes you more stressed and less emotionally available. Your child picks up on that stress and becomes more anxious, which confirms your fear that you're damaging them, which increases your guilt. It's a feedback loop with no easy off switch.
So how do you break that? Because you can't just tell a parent in Jerusalem or Kharkiv to stop feeling guilty. That's like telling someone to stop a sneeze. The feeling is physiological.
You can't just wish it away. But what you can do, and what effective interventions do, is reframe the narrative. Instead of, I am damaging my child, the goal is to shift to, I am my child's primary protector, and my calm is their strongest shield. It moves the focus from the uncontrollable external threat to the controllable internal response. It's not about the sirens, it's about what you do in the 90 seconds after the siren. It turns the parent from a passive victim of circumstance into an active agent in their child's safety narrative.
That feels like an impossible ask, though. Your city is being bombed. Your nervous system is shot. How do you access calm? It's not a resource you can just summon.
You don't have to be calm. You have to be regulated. They're different. You can be terrified but regulated. Regulated means your actions are deliberate, not panicked. It means your voice is steady even if your hands are shaking. And that's a skill that can be coached. There are programs now, in Ukraine and in Israel, that teach parents regulate, relate, reason. You can't reason with a 9-month-old about geopolitics. But you can regulate your own breathing. You can take one deep breath before you move. You can relate through touch and a steady voice. And then, in moments of quiet, you can provide appropriate explanations for older children. The sequence is critical. Regulation first, connection second, explanation a distant third.
The reason part comes later. First, you have to get through the 90 seconds. You have to get the system back online.
And this brings us to the community dimension, which is often the missing piece. The nuclear family under siege is an evolutionary mismatch. Humans raise children in groups. Conflict, perversely, can sometimes force a return to that. The isolation of modern parenting is stripped away by necessity.
How so? Doesn't conflict tear communities apart?
When your social structures are stripped away, new ones form out of necessity. In Beirut during the Civil War, parents in bomb shelters created informal playground co-ops. They pooled toys. They took turns watching each other's kids so parents could sleep, or just have 20 minutes to not be on. That mutual aid is a documented buffer against trauma. It reduces the allostatic load, the cumulative wear and tear of stress, on any single parent. It's not charity, it's survival calculus. I will watch your child now so that you can remain functional enough to watch mine later.
It's the village, but the village is a bomb shelter.
In a sense. And the research shows that the presence of that village, that social support, is a stronger predictor of positive child outcomes than the intensity of the conflict itself. A child in a moderate conflict zone with strong community support can fare better than a child in a low conflict zone with an isolated, overwhelmed parent. The conflict is the storm, but the community is the levee.
That speaks to the stay or leave calculus, which is its own special hell. Daniel's prompt mentions the anguish of that decision. And I've seen studies that show the stress of deciding to leave, of actually uprooting, can be greater than the stress of staying for the first 6 months. It's the devil you know versus the devil you don't. But the devil you don't is also homelessness and statelessness.
A 2025 APA study on conflict migration confirmed that. The acute trauma of displacement, losing your home, your community, your language, your economic footing, can be more dysregulating for a young child's system than the chronic, familiar stress of the known danger. There's a perverse comfort in the devil you know. The shelter is familiar. The siren is predictable. A refugee camp in a foreign country is chaos on every level. New smells, new languages, no routine, no certainty. For a child's nervous system, predictability is safety, even if the predictable thing is a siren.
So what's the long view? If you make it through, what happens to these kids 20 years later? Are they walking bundles of PTSD? Is this a generational sentence?
The longitudinal data is fascinating and again points to resilience. The Belfast Children's Study followed a cohort born at the height of the Troubles in Northern Ireland from 1998 to 2010. They found that while children from conflict-affected families had higher rates of anxiety disorders and hypervigilance in adolescence, those outcomes were almost entirely mediated by one factor: parental emotional availability.
Not the violence they witnessed, but the emotional presence of their parent.
The children whose parents, despite everything, remained emotionally attuned, who could still play, still comfort, still laugh with them. Those children had outcomes in young adulthood that were statistically comparable to the general population. The conflict was part of their story, but it didn't define their neurology. The parental relationship buffered the trauma. It acted as a psychological insulator.
That's the hopeful finding. The bomb shelter isn't the protective factor. The parent in the bomb shelter is.
And that's the practical takeaway. For parents in crisis, the minimum viable routine isn't about elaborate schedules. It's about one or two consistent regulating touchpoints. The same song every bedtime. The same phrase whispered during a siren. "We are safe. I am here." The content is less important than the consistency. It's a signal that says, even in this chaos, some things remain true. It's an anchor in the storm.
For those of us not in conflict zones, what's the lesson? Because we all have our own crises, our own chaos, even if it's not artillery. It's job loss, illness, divorce, societal upheaval.
The lesson is universal. Your regulation is your child's environment. If you are drowning in your own stress, your child is drowning with you. Seeking help, building your own support network, managing your own nervous system isn't selfish. It's the most fundamental act of parenting. You can't pour from an empty cup, but more importantly, your child is drinking from whatever is in your cup. If your cup is full of resentment, fear, and dysregulation, that's what they're consuming.
By the way, fun fact for the nerds listening, today's script was powered by Xiaomi MiMo V2 Pro. Just a little behind the scenes tidbit.
Thanks to them. So, to close this out, is resilience a trait you're born with, or is it forged in crisis?
That's the big question, and the research suggests it's both. Some kids have a more plastic, adaptive nervous system from the start, but even for those who don't, the forge isn't the crisis itself. The forge is the relationship with a caregiver who, in the midst of the crisis, says, "I am here with you. We will get through this together." The fire is the conflict. The steel is the bond.
As climate instability and political fragmentation increase, the number of children growing up in what we traditionally call crisis zones is going to rise. The lessons from Jerusalem, from Kiev, from Sarajevo, from Belfast, these aren't niche case studies anymore. They're becoming universal manuals for parenting on a turbulent planet.
And the core lesson is disarmingly simple and incredibly hard. The most powerful protective factor for a child isn't a bomb shelter or a foreign passport or a perfect routine. It's a parent who is present, regulated, and loving. Everything else is logistics.
Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop.
And big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. If you're enjoying the podcast, a quick review on your podcast app really does help us reach new listeners. We've been My Weird Prompts. Stay safe out there.
Be well. This episode was produced using Xiaomi MiMo V2 Pro. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My Weird Prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep weird.